Hi, I'm Ron James with the Center for Ethical Business Cultures, and I'd like to welcome you to a webinar focused on U.S. and China business relations, navigating two very different cultures. Clearly, there are exciting opportunities and challenges as one elects to do business in the East. The question is, how do you navigate these very different cultures? We're glad that you've joined us today. I'll introduce our speaker shortly, Steve Fellman. He is a faculty member at the Case Western Reserve University, and he will give us his insights on how one navigates these two very different cultures. But first, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the event, the Catherine B. Anderson Fund, as well as CEBC member companies. Your generosity helps to make programs like this available. At the Center for Ethical Business Cultures, we are serving as your hosts this morning. We are located inside of the Opus College of Business at the University of St. Thomas. We exist to help business leaders as they build ethical and profitable business cultures. We serve both the business community as well as the academic community. By offering programs and services and public events, we raise awareness on the important ethical themes of the day. And with our academic partners, we engage in research, exploring what are the challenges businesses face, and try and bring those insights into the classroom to inform the next generation of leaders. I'm Ron James again, and I will serve as your moderator, but we're pleased to have as our featured speaker and presenter today Dr. Stephen Fellman. Steve is Professor of Design and Innovation at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western University. His primary research focus is on American and Chinese business relations. He has done quite a bit of work in this area, examining extensively ethical and cultural differences. He spent time teaching in Shanghai as the Fulbright Distinguished Lecturer in Business Ethics at Shanghai International Studies University. During that time, he conducted research for his book released in 2013, Trouble in the Middle, American-Chinese Business Relations, Culture, Conflict, and Ethics. His book and his research explores these two different cultures and how they differ in their approach to business. How do Chinese and American executives perceive ethical dimensions of doing business? What are some of the challenges American executives face in China and vice versa? Steve earned his PhD in 1983 from the Wharton School of Business, and he holds a master's degree from the University of Oregon and a BA from Linfield College. He joined Case Western in 1983, and coming this July, he'll be going to Beijing to continue his research for 1 year at Peking University. Steve, we are so glad that you're with us today.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's dive right in. We've organized the conversation. Steve's going to share some of his perspectives in three categories. He'll give us some insights into the environment, both from an economic and governmental standpoint in China. Secondly, he'll talk a little bit about corruption and anti-corruption efforts that are underway. And lastly, he'll talk about the culture, wrapping up by sharing some mini cases that he has been engaged in. As he's talking, we invite you to jot down a question and send it off, and we'll be glad to reserve some time at the end to respond to questions that you might have. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve, and welcome again.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you to David Rodborn for inviting me to speak about China. I'm very interested in that topic. So I'm going to give a big picture on the economy, government, and courts, and then go on and talk about corruption and Chinese business culture, and then end with those many cases that Ron had mentioned. So I'll get started right up here. So on the Chinese economy, what kind of capitalism is it? Actually, the Chinese don't call it capitalism. They call it market socialism. In the West, we call it state capitalism, where the state is central to the functioning of the economy. This can be seen most clearly in the SOE sector, SOE, state-owned enterprises. It's 1/3 of GDP, but it is the key 1/3, what Lenin called the commanding heights of the economy. Communications, energy, natural resources, transportation, steel, chemicals, defense, banking, and a few others. These are industries dominated by state-owned and protected monopolies. I want to focus on the banks because the banking controls capital, which is the blood supply of capitalism. 80 to 90% of loans are controlled by 4 big state-owned banks. So 80-90% of the loans going out of these banks. Almost all these loans go to the SOE sector. The private sector is basically starved for capital to some extent. All this money going to inefficient and corrupt SOEs. They're not all inefficient and corrupt, but you have big inefficient and corrupt problems with the SOEs. So all this money going to the SOEs and local governments has led to a huge debt problem. Basically, the whole financial system is set up to support the power base of the Communist Party by underpinning the SOE sector and government-controlled development. The stock markets and the bond markets are pieces of this system. As they say in the US, follow the money if you want to know what's going on. The Communist Party gets its money from 3 places. 1, from taxes, 2, from SOE profits, and 3, from the population savings accounts, which are funneled into those same state-owned banks. The people really don't have a lot of options where to put their money. These banks pay low interest rates, and then the banks reinvest the money at higher rates, often internationally, and then plow the money, the profits from that reinvestment, back into the SOEs and the government system. This is the economic structure of the Communist Party's power base. The SOEs not only benefit from cheap money, they also get lower taxes, cheap land, groomed and selected personnel, government procurement contracts, and other stuff. So there's not quite a free market in China. They've had certainly have opened up markets there, and we're all participating in them. But you have this big government, state-owned, protected monopoly sector. So it's not completely a free market, or not even real close. Private businesses struggle in this system. I'll move on to a couple comments about the private sector. So that's 2/3 of GDP. Estimated there are over 40 million private firms. Research says they're more profitable than the SOEs. They're mostly small, mom and pop kind of firms. The larger privates must cooperate with the government. So if you're a large private, you're really not very autonomous. You might even have a Communist Party department inside of your company. So the 1/3 state, 2/3 GDP ratio. So say in 1978, 95% of everything was owned by the government. So now only a 1/3 of GDP is from the government state-owned enterprises. So it looks like it's going in the right direction. But my sense, we've sort of hit a wall here, that 1/3 state GDP number is probably not going to decline. It's 30-35%. And the reason is, from what I've already said, that it plays a big role in the political base of the Communist Party and the SOEs. So because of that political, I think that 2/3 GDP coming from private, 1/3 GDP coming from state-owned is going to be around for a while. I don't see it changing. They're talking about increasing the role of the privates, but talking is one thing and doing is something else. That number's been there for at least a decade, more than that. Now, privates are highly entrepreneurial. They're mostly in low-end manufacturing and services. The government's goal is to develop the economy and move up the value chain. They want to see more innovation, more technological innovation, more broad-based societal consumption. It's unclear to me whether or how much they're going to be able to achieve these goals. Again, they're talking about it. They have increased some societal consumption, but they face some blocks. One, there's broad-based corruption with the government and in the private sector, really quite broad-based. Poor education system, or at least one not really strongly supportive of a creative, innovative business culture. Three, perceptions of political instability on the part of the population. 60% or more people who are worth $1 million either have a second visa or are trying to get one. So the people who the cream of the crop, they want to have one foot outside of China. They're worried about their security there and the security of their assets. So that's a big issue that the population perceives the potential for political instability or a predatory government. Four, inefficiencies that I mentioned with the SOE sector. Five, the huge debt problem I mentioned. They might be able to manage that. Unclear. It's a big one. Six, a one-party political system focused primarily on its own survival. So you have the government's doing a lot of things for itself. Building the economy is for itself because they're going to need that to survive. That's their core base of legitimacy is economic development and creating wealth. But they have a lot of pools in different directions. And seven, these are some of the challenges to continued development. So they've had enormous development over the last 30 years. First 30 years after the reform started, averaging 10% GDP growth. But the numbers, 9%, 8%, 7.5%. Now for 2015, they're looking at 7%. Still a very big number. But you can see the trend, the low-hanging fruit has been eaten, and it's getting more and more difficult. And of course, no one's going to grow at 10% forever. Okay, that's my comments on the economy. I'm going to move over to the government now. As we know, it's authoritarian. It's been that way. That's all it's ever been. So it's been that way for 2,000 years. So you have very deep, tacit cultural roots to that authoritarian tendencies. So they're not going to change real easily. A small group controls the government, maybe less than 10 people, maybe 5 people. So it's really quite a small group. They have different parliaments and things like that, but it's mostly rubber stamp as far as I can tell. So really quite a small number of people in charge. After 37 years of reforms, democracy is not in sight. And I was just reading the other day, the only election they ever had on the national level was in 1913. It was one election, and it fell apart immediately afterwards. Dynasty fell around 1910. 2,000 years of dynasty. They tried to move to a democracy, and things fell apart. And then there was a lot of trouble until 49 when the communists finally won all the infighting going on. So 37 years, no democracy. We've seen from the reforms, maybe some very low-level stuff in the villages. Huge government bureaucracy they have, probably, I'm just guessing, 80 million people working in the government, maybe 100 million. The Communist Party and the government are two different overlapping systems. The army reports to the Communist Party. It does not report to the government. So you have a one-party state here. Basically, it's the Leninist model. That's where they originate, and that's pretty much what they still have, where the Communist Party controls most everything. The social contract with the population, in my mind, looks something like this. You are free to go into business. You're free to make as much money as you can make. You are free to experiment culturally. And both of those things are very different from the Mao era, from 49 to 76. So, but now you have freedom to go into business, to make money, they even encourage it. But as you saw, the loans don't support it so much. Freedom in culture, you can wear high-heel shoes, short skirts, do a lot of different things like that, and you have freedom to travel inside the country, outside the country, but you are not free to participate in the political system. Violators are either bullied, jailed, or worse. Moving on to the courts. The courts report to the government. It's sort of like a ministry reports to the government of the United States, like Homeland Security reports to the president. That's how the courts are. So the kind of autonomy, we have a wall between the government and the court system in the United States. They don't have that in China. Courts are just one more ministry. If you are charged, you're pretty much going to be found guilty. Once you get charged, it's like a 95% conviction rate. The laws in the courts reflect Western models and practices, so that's not the problem. It's not the design of the system. They've used European and American and more American models in their court system. The problem is political interference is normal. So if it's important politically, the answer is going to come down from the higher levels of the Communist Party, what the verdict should be. There is some progress here and there, but as far as I can tell, it goes backwards more than it goes forwards. And right now, it could be getting worse. But that's the thing about China. You never really know. The situation is always fluid, and it is always murky. In general, you do not have the rule of law, but the rule by law. The law is one more instrument of power instead of a check on power. Also, corruption extends to the courts. Judges can be bribed. Okay, moving on to corruption. There has been corruption throughout the last 37 years of reforms. It ebbs and flows. It spiked in the mid-1990s when they made the big move to markets. I mean, it was extremely quite out in the open there. Anti-corruption campaigns come and go also since 1980. In 2007, when I was doing field work, Chinese middlemen were carrying out bribes for American firms to protect them from both Chinese regulators and the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. In 2008, the Chinese anti-corruption laws were expanded and prosecutions increased. And that 9, 10, that was increasing during that period. I was back in 10. But most Chinese executives see prosecutions as removal of political competitors, not the rule of law, not the application of the rule of law. So you hear about these prosecutions, and sometimes even get the death penalty, but when you talk to Chinese executives who've been there all their lives, they see it as politics, not the rule of law. Some Chinese executives estimate 80 to 90% of government officials are corrupt. Also around 2008, Obama increased enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So from our side, Obama 2008 put an emphasis on this. If your Chinese partner, supply chain, or middleman paid bribes, the American firm can be prosecuted. U.S. prosecutions and fines have increased. Now, 2015, 2014, we have the mother of all anti-corruption campaigns in China. Unprecedented high levels of Communist parties of officials are being prosecuted. Generals, Politburo, Standing Committee, one member from that previous regime that went out in 2013. This is unheard of. He's been arrested. But we still have the same question. Is this an attempt to clean up the Communist Party, or is it removing one's political competitors? After all, politics in China is a contact sport. It's safe to say it's both cleanup and competitor removal. But what's the end game here? Is it A, clean up the Communist Party, B, concentrate on President Xi's power, or C, increase political infighting and political chaos? I mean, this is a major power play that this anti-corruption campaign that President Xi is implementing. And he's, on one hand, it looks like he's very strong, he's doing that. But on the other hand, he's generating some very powerful enemies, even the previous presidents. So where's this going to end up? That's the question, and I don't know the answer to that question, but those are the three options I see. Cleaning up the Communist Party, Xi's just going to concentrate his power, be a strong man that we haven't had really since Mao, or things are going to fall apart. There's going to be a lot of chaos, political chaos. Moving on to Chinese business cultures, or business culture. Talk a little bit about my view of it. Because of the authoritarian state, the Chinese have always formed small, informal social networks. This is really a key issue, a key aspect of that business culture. To network with powerful officials and protect themselves from powerful officials, because there's always been powerful officials at the center of everything. This is called guanxi, this networking. These networks can be up to 200 to 300 people. They used to have family members at their core. There's still a lot of family involved. China is a family country. But capitalism/markets is increasing individualism, really just in the last decade or two. Networks are becoming more complex. In an intense, huge, ruthless market, you need these networks. Chinese develop these networks by making friends. Chinese make friends by giving gifts. For thousands of years, the Chinese have given gifts to make friends. Gift giving is an art and a culture in China and throughout Asia. Americans see the gifts as bribes often. There's been barrels of ink spilled on the difference between a gift and a bribe in China. I would say this: the Chinese give gifts. If you do business in China, nice gifts will help you build relationships. It is a different business culture. To some extent, you need to adjust to it. But don't give gifts to government officials, because you'll be in violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Okay, coming to the end, I have two mini business cases. Let me tell you what they are, and I'll end with a question for each of them. The first one, an American Fortune 500 company moves their headquarters for Asia to Shanghai. They hire many Chinese staff, one of which, a female Chinese accountant reporting to the American CFO, moves the company bank account from one bank to another bank without authorization. Her husband works at the second bank and received a promotion for bringing in the new account. No money was lost. In fact, it was a better bank account. The president of Asia, the American Fortune 500 company, finds out about the event and fires the Chinese accountant. His reasoning: it was against company policy, and she had been trained to follow the policies. My question: was it ethical to fire the accountant? Let me move on to the second mini case.
And just to clarify before you move on, Steve, you've raised the question. If people have an opinion on that, we invite you to send us a note as to whether or not the individual should be fired or not, and we'll play that back to Steve and get his take on what should happen in this case. So as he's reading the second scenario, be thinking about the first scenario and whether or not you would encourage the CEO by saying you did the right thing, or no, this really wasn't the ethical thing to do. Okay, go ahead please, Steve.
Thank you. The second mini case. Large American retailers like Walmart and Target are worried that the mistreatment of workers in their Chinese supply chains will make it into the American media and do damage to their reputations. So they hire Chinese firms to carry out ethics audits at Chinese factories to make sure workers are not mistreated. Factories can lose their contracts if they do not meet standards of these audits. The factories are evaluated for employee welfare, employee health care, and whether the minimum wage is paid. The evaluations also investigate whether the factories have 1, an anti-terrorism plan, 2, carry out background checks on employees before hiring, 3, have less than 6 employees per dorm room, 4, have privacy doors on the toilets, 5, provide soap in the showers, and 6, provide health care. So these are the ethics audits, look into these things, and if you don't have a good score on this, you'll lose your contract with the American companies. So my question is, are the ethics audits ethical?
Okay, so in this in the second case, with Walmart and Target, if I understood you correctly, Steve, they're concerned about the mistreatment of workers. They actually hire Chinese auditors and tell them to look at some very specific things like health care and the welfare of the employees, to look at minimum wage, but also to do some background checks and make sure that those have been done, to look at anti-terrorism, and then to look at living conditions. And the question you're raising is, would these audits be considered ethical?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, let's pause, and we'll go back to the first question, and to briefly highlight again. It sounds like companies move their headquarters to Shanghai. The CEO and CFO are Americans. They have a Chinese financial accountant who works to bring a new banking relationship into the firm, but it happens to be the bank that her spouse works at who gets a significant promotion. And the question you're raising is, should the financial accountant be terminated? All right. Yeah. Okay. That's
the one other that she supposedly did not have authorization to move the account.
She didn't have authorization. Okay. Well, I'd like to invite your perspective on this, please, Steve, and then maybe we can examine the alternative to that for a few minutes as well. What are your thoughts?
Okay. So the question is, was it ethical to fire the accountant? The vast majority of American and Chinese executives I asked this question say yes, it is ethical to fire her. Way over 50%. But I disagree. Even though everyone agrees it was wrong, she was caught between two cultures. The American one of formal business rules, and the Chinese one of the Confucian family, where she has a primary obligation to support her husband. So my suggestion in that situation is that she gets a second chance. Obviously, you can't have people moving bank accounts around without authorization, but given the cultural conflict, the newly developed business system in China, and that the cultural conflict, in my view, is so profound, I think she should get a second chance, more training, and try to move forward. She had an excellent reputation for integrity, had high reviews on the quality of her work. She clearly made a mistake here, but I think a second chance is in order, given the cultural conflict, the depth of the cultural conflict involved.
If you look at the formality of the Western culture, where there is a set of rules that have been set by the corporation, there is no legal rule that would have precluded the financial accountant from moving the business, but there was an internal corporate policy about following due process to select a new banking relationship. But the financial accountant chose instead to use an Eastern approach, which was much more about relationships and finding win-win relationships. And in this case, the new bank got a new relationship with a new client. Her husband received a promotion out of it, and right along with that, in a nutshell, the company got a better set of banking relationships. So everybody won in that situation, and that would have been okay in an Eastern setting. Is that the lens that you're looking at it through?
Well, no, I don't think it would be okay, because even the Chinese you ask this question to, they would have a problem with it.
Mm.
I'm looking at it more in terms of the conflict, that the woman, the husband-wife relationship in the Confucian family is thousands of years old. It's very strong, very important, and that she was in this conflicting situation. I think it's wrong inside China too, but nonetheless, because of the reforms, you have this changing situation, and you have this woman who grew up in one system and now is in another system, and these two systems are in conflict, and they're both very strong systems. The Confucian the husband-wife relationship is one of four cardinal Confucian relationships, and the wife is supposed to be subservient there and to support her husband. And of course, in the United States, we have rules, we have policies, and we take them very serious, and there should be consequences. It's the conflict between these two systems where I have some empathy for the position the woman was in.
Okay. All right. As we're preparing to go to the second scenario, we invite you again to type in any questions that you might have, and we'll be glad to ask Steve for his opinion on those. Steve, let's get your opinion on the second scenario. Was the use of Chinese auditors, is that ethical or not in this case? What's your take on it, please, Steve?
Right. Again, I think it's okay to use the auditors, but it should not have been so one-sided. This audit was designed in the United States by Americans with little concern for the context in China. A lot of things that were being evaluated were outside the control of the Chinese, or just was bizarre to them. Didn't make any sense to them inside of their cultural world they live in. So I see it as this particular, not ethical audits in general, but this particular audit that I described here, I don't think it's ethical. They're forcing American cultural values on the Chinese, where there's neither the cultural context to justify some of these requirements nor the economic context to support them. For one thing, the Chinese have the Hoku system, which gives different health care to city people from country people. So if you're in the country, the government's not paying your health care. A Chinese manufacturer in the country has to deal with that. It raises his cost. The Americans, my guess is, they didn't even know that difference there. That if you have for the Chinese manufacturer in the city, healthcare is being paid for by the government. In the country, it's not. A manufacturer is not going to have the margin to pay for healthcare for his worker out in the country. So it really wasn't possible. Privacy doors on toilets. That's clearly an American preference. It's not a Chinese preference. It's quite common that Chinese do not have privacy doors, or they don't provide soap in the showers, or 6 people to a dorm room. This is just not issues inside of Chinese culture. These are issues inside of American culture, yet we're using it to evaluate the Chinese. So in my view, there should have been I think the intention is good to make sure that Chinese employees aren't being mistreated, but there should have been some communication between the American firms who wanted this audit carried out and the Chinese manufacturers upon who the audit was going to be carried out. There should have been they should have worked together to come up with what are the reasonable and right ways to measure the audit. Instead of this one-sided approach where some of it just can't be achieved, and some of it doesn't even make any sense to the Chinese. The terrorism thing, there's this anti-terrorism. Well, we've had a lot of terrorism in the U.S. after, in 9/11, and that's after this thing was created. But China, through most of the reforms, hasn't had any terrorism, especially in its manufacturing plants. So this just seems silly to the Chinese. And just like the toilets and the showers, it didn't make any sense to them.
Understand. We do have a question from our listeners, um, and it's a question on team dynamics. In this case, there's a China team and a U.S. team made up of analysts and managers on both teams. Are there certain hierarchy, tenure, or collaboration considerations that this organization needs to be aware of as they partner with their China nationals?
Okay, good question. It's a little abstract for me in terms of answering it in the abstract. I probably would want to know a little more about that particular organization. But I guess what I would say in terms of what you want to know with the China group is there could be subgroups there and loyalty in different subgroups. And some groups might not be communicating with each other. So it'd be good to know who has relationships with who. The Chinese tend to group up based on where they went to college or what province they're from or what village they're from. So if there are subgroups, I guess that would be my primary reaction. I've seen that in the classroom. I've seen that in Chinese organizations where there could be subgroups, very strong loyalty inside those subgroups, very little communication across them. So certainly that would be something to be sensitive to. Who has relationships with who, and just what the network is there, or the multiple networks inside the organization.
Here's another question. You touched on some of the changes under the new administration in China and a focus on anti-corruption, and you raised several questions about motives and what really were the long-term implication. This question asks you to continue to talk about that. Specifically, do you see other changes between the U.S. and China business cultures since the economic reforms have been put in place? Are there new themes that are opening up? And is China shifting to a more Western business culture, or is there active and explicit resistance?
Well, certainly the business environment in China has changed radically since the reforms. Reforms started around 1980. Before that, you have the Cultural Revolution, where basically there's no business being done. I think the per capita GDP in 1976 was about $150. Things had completely fallen apart. So we have quite a economic juggernaut being developed over the last few decades. In terms of new themes emerging, how much more privatization? They're talking a lot about more privatization, leaning more on markets, developing more markets, private property, private ownership. But again, talking is one thing. They're running into a lot of resistance. That SOE sector I talked about, those are really the giant corporations in the economy. There's interest groups running them, and they're blocking a lot of moves towards privatization and towards more of a market economy. So you have this battle going on to some extent, and it's unclear how that's going to shape up. Another major theme going on that I mentioned before is the anti-corruption campaign. It is very big. Profits in Macau at the gambling casinos are way down. That's where a lot of the corrupt money used to be spent. Luxury items, very expensive things for the super rich. Those markets, those businesses, their products sales are way down. So this anti-corruption campaign is having a big effect. But again, where it's going, I don't know. But I think it probably has slowed down some of the corruption, but mostly it has probably moved it deeper and deeper underground. People are just much more careful and cautious. There's still a lot of corruption going on. In terms of are they shifting to Western business culture, I would say no. This is a very old, very large society, old culture. What we're going to see there emerging as they engage in markets and state capitalism is their own kind of system. It'll probably have some resemblance to other Asian countries. It's a fascinating question. I do not see it moving to, they're not going to be future Americans. I don't see it moving to a Western business culture. They're going to have to deal more internationally to some extent. And they've joined different international agreements, but there's a lot of tensions there. And I think we'll have somewhat of a unique business culture continuing to emerge. That's one of the things I'm interested in to study, to see how that emerges over time. But I don't see it as a Western model.
We have just 1 minute left, and I wanted to squeeze in one more question if I could, Steve.
Okay.
And that is based on your book, Trouble in the Middle. You talk about how middle people are used to bridge the divide between Eastern and Western cultures, American and China. This question really is about any thoughts you'd have about how one might pick someone to be in the middle. Are there 2 or 3 important things that one should be paying attention to? Are there any lessons or insights that you've learned from experiences that you've had in terms of picking someone to be in the middle?
Yeah, well, one thing, yeah, I interviewed a lot of Chinese middlemen. I was quite fascinated with them. One thing I would say, you certainly want to look at their track record. There's a lot of people trying to get into that business. They're going to say, yeah, I'll be your middleman. They speak English, but it'd be best if somebody has a track record that they've worked with other American companies, and you possibly get references or see what they've accomplished. So a track record would be one thing. Second thing is you're going to want to ask them carefully, maybe not completely directly, what kind of connections do they have? Because that's what the middleman does. Or one of the key things the middleman does is he provides connections into the economy and also into the government. So you're going to want to ask what relationships he or she has, and especially with the government. Because that's how that system works. That's how business in China works. That you can't do business over there without doing business with the government. So you want a middleman that has good relationships with some important people in the government and can find out information, hopefully legally, and be able to compete in a network-based economy. And then the third thing I think would be reliability. You want someone who's going to be good on the word. I guess that's obvious, but that's certainly something to be sensitive to, because a lot of times you won't get that. And then the last thing I'd mention, you're going to want somebody with dual cultural knowledge, because part of being the middleman, they not only have connections in China and understand how things work in China, but they have to communicate that to you. And they're not going to be able to do that if they don't understand you to some extent, and American business culture. So they need to be unusual. They need to have knowledge not just of China, but of both business cultures, so that they can communicate things that aren't done in the U.S., and it's going to be new to an American executive, but it's common in China. So the middleman needs to know something about American business to be able to translate those practices and connections that are so key in China.
Our time has come to an end. Our guest today has been Steve Fellman, professor at Case Western University, who is an expert on looking at American-Chinese business relations. Steve, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
And thanks to our listening audience. We very much appreciate you joining us. This has been a webinar hosted by the Center for Ethical Business Cultures at the Opus College of Business and the University of St. Thomas. Have a great day, and we look forward to the next time we can connect. Take care.